Hello, welcome back to another video about Reflexis Flow. This is the fourth and I think last video in our series called Writing Parts. Parts are the building blocks of our platform, and in the first two videos I actually did I did two live coding sessions, and we created a small editor part for one of our current projects. And in the third video, I actually presented all of the information, all of the techniques and all of the details that are involved when you write your own parts. So today, I think it's a good idea to simply look at a few existing parts. So I selected 4 of them, and it's probably a good idea to point out some of the details so you understand how things fit together, and hopefully it'll give you a few pointers of about how you may go about writing your own parts. So let's start. Actually, the first part is actually the part that we created previously, and I think at the time, because everything was new, not everything may have been obvious. So let's quickly go through the part and see if things make more sense now you've seen the whole picture. So if I fold this part, you should now recognize the standard methods, like the present method, the processing method, respond method for acting asynchronously, and the validate method that helps you and helps others check if your part is being used the right way. So here's the info section, and the render method. Here it's a method, so it's a function that's made that we've put into the part table, but it's not actually an official method. It's just something that we came up with, and it's not called directly by Flow itself. So why did we come up with the rendering method? Because while the page is being built, so during the present phase, the editor should be able to render itself, but since it can also act as a viewer, it should also be able to update itself without the entire page being reloaded. So it should be able to update itself asynchronously. And that's the reason why we created a separate rendering method, because it's being used from the present method, and it's also being used from the respond method. So in just looking at the present method, this should look very familiar now. What present methods usually do is, create a container. Container should always have IDs like this. So there's a fixed prefix, and here goes the name of the part. And anything that goes inside the container can be refreshed, can be replaced during respond, a call to respond. So here's the connecting to the refresh verb. Connecting means, okay, you can send me a refresh verb, and since the refresh verb is the only thing that connects, we know that whenever this method is called, it's always about refreshing and not anything else. But let's go back to the rendering method. Here's the Scratchpad. You may recall well, let's simply look at it. When handling any input during the processing phase, we found that we, wanted to detect any faulty input, and anything that we detected. As soon as you detect any errors in the input, you want to provide some feedback, and that's what we did. We used the Scratchpad to remember all the values that the user entered, but also remember what went wrong. That's something that you see here. Well, moving on. Here is something that should look very familiar now. Element IDs. So this part creates a series of page elements. So it can create, any number of inputs. It can create any number of drop downs, and you need to provide IDs and names to these elements. And what I've shown you in the previous 3 videos is that this here is a good way to come up with IDs that do not conflict with other IDs. So please note, it starts with the name of the part. There's a double underscore, and then there's anything that you would care to put after it and would make sense to you. So this is something that might be worth pointing out. So the selected bit. Selected, if you look at this, if any of the drop-down entries, items, had to be, the current selection, this is the test that we needed to perform. But if you look at this line, then if this fails, selected is, it's a false value. It's not a string, because here it says if item is value, then then it's the string, and we left this bit out, and that's something that I wanted to point out, because the print function that parts use can be fed strings. It can be fed numbers, but it can also be fed nil values or false values. And if you put in a nil or a false value, it'll simply ignore that part and basically skip the argument, and that makes it very easy to print stuff conditionally. So for instance, I could say like if item is 5, if I is 5, then add the item. So here is a conditional expression. An item would only be printed if this condition was true. So that's a little trick that's worth remembering, because it makes printing stuff a lot easier. Also, please note that you don't need to concatenate strings. You can simply, so you don't need to do something like this. You can simply put in as many arguments to the print function as you like, and that actually makes it very fast, and because you don't need to, you can actually skip the string concatenation, and print takes care of all that for you. The processing function, is there anything worthwhile pointing out still? The escaping, here we talked about security. Security bears repeating, so always never really, never accept any input without validating that it's okay, or sanitizing it, and that's something that really needs to be in the back of your mind, whenever you write your own parts. Yes, this is the bit that I forgot to add. during the session. So the help field, so properties. So the field section describes the properties of a part. So the description basically gives a brief description of what it does, but the fields section lists the various properties. And so the property definition is a path. It's a required property. So anyone who plugs this part into a flow needs to set this particular property. And here is this a description of what the property does, and it goes into this field. Well, we can. I think we can leave it at this. Let's. The require call. Please note that this is now the desired way to require stuff. In all our old code, we used to do something like this, and you can still use it like this, and all the functions would be assigned to a predefined table. So in this case, it would have been this, and this would work. This is not the best way to do this anymore. So if you write new code, or if you revisit old code, please use this approach and assign all the functions to your own local table and use that instead. Actually, so the processing method actually always processes things that come in, but that actually only makes sense for if the part acts in editor mode. Yes. So if it's in view mode, you don't need to do anything, and we can pretty much skip this. That's something that we didn't add. So let's add it. Yeah. Yeah. Just realized. Yeah. So let's see if I broke anything. Nope. Well, then it must be good. Let's see what I changed. Yeah, that's the only bit. All right. Okay, let's move on to another part. And I actually chose an existing project part. So this is not part of the base collection, but just another part for our project, and it's a very small part, as you can see. This is a variation on the standard condition part, so it's a routing part. Routing is essentially choosing the next step, and since routing only occurs during the processing phase, this part only has a process method, and in this case a validate method. But the process method is interesting because here it actually inspects the target. So I explained in the last video that assigning anything to this variable means is the same as telling Flow to choose this a gate to move to the next step. And I also mentioned that if the gate's already been set, then by convention we don't touch it anymore, because this makes it much easier to reason about the behavior of the flow. And this is how that convention is implemented. Simply check if it's already set, and if it's set, leave it alone. And here we retrieve the condition. So if it's not a string, then something's really amiss. And actually, this is also something worth pointing out. This part uses more advanced error signaling. It's something that we did not discuss previously. But if a part sets this to true, it basically promises Flow that whenever it's being called, it'll signal back if the call was successful or not. So so in this case, the process method is something that's being called directly from Flow, and here it says, okay, I'm returning, but everything's okay. And here it says if there is no condition property set, then it's never going to be okay. So it actually returns a nil and the description of the error. And this is actually a very nice way to tell Flow what's going on, and if things are going right or things are going wrong. And all the old parts, we simply didn't have this mechanism yet, so we've retrofitted some of these parts, but many are still still don't use this mechanism. But it's worthwhile adding, because it makes the system much more aware of what goes wrong and where things go wrong. So if there is a condition, it's being evaluated here. This is just a library call that we've pulled in from the system script. And again, here, it could be that the modeler, so whoever built the flow, did put in a condition property, but the syntax of the condition property didn't make any sense. So if the syntax is already wrong, the part will never really operate correctly, because the expression is always going to evaluate to false. So that's something that's here being signaled back as well. Like, the condition doesn't make any sense. I could never run this condition and evaluate it. So, but if things do go according to plan, then the condition either evaluates the true or false. And here you see the assignment that performs the routing. So, and like the standard condition part, this project condition part actually, chooses either the true gate or the false gate, and then it says, well, things went well. The validate method is interesting as well, because it actually shows you here that you actually get access to the gates, that are defined for the step where this part is plugged into. So what you see here is this part checks, do I have a condition? If it's there, and if there were some gates provided, we know that both the true gate and the false gate need to be present on the step. And if it's not, it uses the callback to signal the missing gate. No. So this is a very simple part, but I think it's interesting to study. So let's move on to another very simple part. So and this is a base part that's part of the regular distribution. This is the standard clear part. Standard clear is a part that simply allows you to zap things in your session context or somewhere else if you're using conduits. I think I mentioned in one of the earlier videos that you need to make sure that you don't blow up your data space. You don't grow your session context and make it grow very, very big. So standard clear is something that you can use to move out to clear out any data, and it's very handy. If you look at the info section, then you can see that you can either set a path property or a paths property for multiple paths, so whatever path you set is being cleared. But I wanted to show you this part, not because it's so simple, but because here we don't have a present method or a process method, but an execute method. So the execute method is something that you would use for server parts. So server part, when I say server parts, it sort of gives the impression that it would only run in server steps, like in steps that perform actions on the server, but that's not necessarily the case. So an execute method basically means I can act, in a present phase or a process phase, and it's up to the part to decide, when to become active. So, and that's what this code is all about. So what you see with many of the base part is that there is a phase property to indicate when this part becomes active. So for interactive parts like buttons or the editor that we saw earlier, they're active in all the phases. So they are active in the present phase because they need to put something in the page. They're active in the processing phase because they need to handle anything that the user put in. But some parts are less interactive, and they only run in a particular phase. And it's up to the modeler to specify the phase that the part runs in. And that's why here, this part, that's why first of all there's an execute method. So it's not predetermined if it's a present or process thing. But here it checks the phase. So here you can read that the default phase is the process phase. And then it actually says, okay, if the current phase is not my phase, then I'm out of here, then I'm not active. And this line here actually says, so if the current phase is the present method, and my phase is either the present method or the present phase or the respond phase, then I'm connecting to the refresh verb. So what this means is this part can act in all three phases, in one of the three phases, but you can actually say, you can actually specify the respond phase as the phase that this part is active in. So by setting this part, by setting the phase of this part to respond, you're basically saying another part can trigger me, and when I'm being triggered, I'll do my thing. So that's an interesting technique that you can use, which is why I wanted to point it out. Right. Here it says that usually when there's a phase property, there's just a present and a process option. But in this case, this part can act in a respond phase as well, and that's why it's being specified here. All right, let's move on to the fourth and final part. It's a much more complex part. It's actually the drop-down. I thought it would be kind of funny to look at the original drop-down part, because we created a drop-down page element, a drop-down input in our editor. And but obviously there's an official UI/drop-down part that that has pretty much existed since the beginning of Flow, because drop downs are a very nice thing to have, and we've been using it since for over a dozen years. So, and actually, if you look at it, it's actually fairly large. So there's close to 400 lines, while our editor part isn't even 200 lines of code. And the reason for that is that this drop-down part can operate in all kinds of modes. So as soon as you want to present a selection to the user, it becomes a matter of what sort of selection, what sort of items do we need to present? How do we need to present the items? And also when a user does make a selection, and for instance we presented 24 objects, what is the result that you want to save? Is it the entire object? Is it the ID of the object? Is it the name of the object? And these are, so I'm trying to give you an idea of the different modes that the drop-down supports, and that actually make this part relatively complex. Not really complex, but relatively complex in the sense that there are all these scenarios that it supports. So you can provide a list of literal items, or you could plug in an enumeration and specify the database where this enumeration should be pulled from. And you can say, okay, I want to save the text of a literal. When I say literal, you can, for instance, provide just a list of strings, but you can also say, okay, now I have a list of objects, and from these objects, this is the key that you should use for the caption, and this is the key that you should use for the values. And again, that's one of the reasons why this part is much more complex. In any case, let's have a quick browse. So I think I mentioned in the previous session that it's always a good thing to set sensible property defaults. So these are all the defaults, or at least some of the defaults that are being set. And if you look at them, then you can see that they're being used in the code, but also occur in the info section. And let's fold this for a second and see what we have. So we recognize the official methods: the present, the respond, the process, and there's a validate method here as well. Didn't remember that. Let's have a quick look. Yes. So there's a rendering method, pretty much because it uses the same technique of putting a container in the page. Again, with a class. There's a default class that's probably based on the name. And here, for instance, okay, here you see an example of a container that's not a div. So we started out with div containers when we first designed Flow, but at some point we realized that, and that's the reason why it says the prefix is still cdiv, because we thought, okay, container div, but the container doesn't need to be a div. And obviously here it has to be a span, because if we would put the drop down in a div, then it would be very, you have some additional work you need to do if you want to put multiple drop downs side by side, and by using a span, that there's no work involved. So again, there's a rendering method, because rendering happens both synchronously from the present method and asynchronously from the respond method. And let's go back to the present method. And this present method is interesting because here we see that this part supports refresh verb, so it can re-render itself, but also a select verb. And better yet, it actually says I only listen to select verbs if I have associates or if I have a target property. So you setting a target property for this drop-down would mean that if the user makes a selection, that it would immediately try to submit the form. And setting associates obviously would mean that if you make a selection, then it could update, all the dependent parts. And if neither of these properties were set, then it's you don't need to listen to this select verb, and it would not do anything. It would basically allow the user to make a selection, then do some other stuff, and then simply click a button or something else. Here's an example of the register call. We will look at how this select verb is actually being generated from the page in a minute or so. But here you can see that you can use the JavaScript register function that's in the namespace to say, okay, this part, if a select verb is being sent, then the first argument should be called index. And this allows the front-end code. This signals to the front-end code that if it uses the send function and say send select to this verb and the number is 10, then it would actually translate to index is 10. And that's the way that you can handle it in the respond. But first, let's go back to the render function, because there are some interesting things there to see as well. This is a mechanism that you find in many parts. Parts can often have a visible property that controls visibility, and you can set visible to any expression that you like, and if you set it, then it's being evaluated, and this is a really standard way of handling such a visible property. So here we can see that if there is a visible expression and it does not evaluate to true, first of all we remember that we're invisible. So I'm using here the Scratchpad to flag, whatever happens next, I'm invisible, and that's something that we can use later on. I'll show you in a second. And here is the bit that allows you to hide the drop down. This is something that I explained in the previous session. Anything that you print will replace what was already there, and by printing something that's not visible, you actually hide or actually clear out anything that was there. So, and this is exactly what you want. So if the visible expression evaluates to false, make sure that you zap anything that's inside your container and simply return, but not before you remember that you're invisible. And so why would you want to remember that? Well, if we look at the rest of the code, you want to remember that you're invisible because during processing, if you were invisible, if you were not part of the visible page anymore, then you should never do any processing. anymore, because that would be odd. And similarly here, there's a store function. The store function is being used both from the respond method and here during the processing method. The store, sorry about that. So the store function remembers as well. So it knows if I'm not visible, I'm not going to store anything. I'm not going to disrupt anything. Okay, let's go back to the rendering method. Oh. So here's some code that deals with fetching the items. That's not very interesting at this point. Let's look at some of the other bits and pieces. I'm not going to review all the entire part. I just want to point out some of the interesting bits that might be that might give you ideas about how to set up your own parts. So here again, the Scratchpad is being used. If I scroll up, then you can see that it's actually being used to remember all sorts of things. So here it's being used to remember the current index. Let's see what would be interesting to point out. Here, for instance, if there's any feedback that you want to provide, here we set the class to incomplete. That's something that we used for the editor as well. Here you can see the actual drop-down being printed. So here it starts. If there's a caption that allows you to that if you want to enable the user to make no choice, then here there's an entry being printed. There should be a loop here somewhere. Here's the loop for all the items that generate options. Here's the selected trick that we used as well. And here's the end of the drop down. But if I go back here, so if this is a drop down that has associates, or that you want to step away from the page, if the user makes a selection, then you need to add some behavior to this drop down. So you need to add some JavaScript to implement this behavior, and that's what this particular line is all about. So let's put it in the middle here. So here it says if I either have associates or the target is being set, then I create an attribute here, and this attribute actually is a small JavaScript handler. So it says if the selection changes, I want to call this particular JavaScript function that's part of our namespace table. So, and if I now highlight this variable here it's being printed as part of the element. So now the question is, what does this thing do? Let's quickly look at the JavaScript, and there it is. So like I said, the Flow JavaScript library actually has all the generic helpers that you can use for your parts, and that I showed you the list in the previous session. And but if you come up with your own parts, you can create. So there are the generic helpers, and there are helpers for specific base parts. And this is actually, a function. This is the function that is used by the drop-down. So this function here is being put in this onChange attribute here by the UI drop-down part. And whenever the user makes a selection, this is the code that runs. So it actually tries to locate the element, it tries to find the item that was selected, And here you see the send call. So it does not say RFX send because this is inside the library. But here you can see it sends to this part the select verb, and it sends the value of the selected item. And the value of the selected item is this bit here, or this bit here. So it sends the number, the index. So I hope that makes sense. This is the way for you to add specific behavior to your own, to anything you put. You have your own parts put into the page, once a verb is being sent, you need to handle it in your respond method. So let's move to the respond method for a second. So this is a typical respond method that does more than simply refresh. Because we said during the present phase, let's go back here, that we can either respond to a select or a refresh. Here in the respond method, you need to check, what is the incoming verb. And since we registered the first argument as the index argument, so here it should have maybe said this, but we're using the global sparse table. Here we retrieve the number that's coming in, and what you see here, if it's not a number, then we're already out of here. Otherwise, we try to store this number as the result of this part. Here we're putting it in the Scratchpad, and here's the shortcut call. This says trigger all my associates if I have any. And this bit is interesting as well. So obviously either you have associates or you have a target. You cannot have both because that would not make any sense. And actually, we've done our thing. Yeah. No, we have not done our thing. That could be something that we would check in our validate method. That would make sense. Let's see if it's mentioned in the gate to select if the user selects an item. And the associates, where are they? Associates. Indicates which part to happen on input. No, it's not mentioned. So that's something that we could add, at a later date, but it's not that interesting for now. In any case, if the target property was set, then you're actually looking at a respond method that needs to somehow trigger a form submit. And as the JavaScript send function is used to trigger to call the respond method for a part, you can use this technique to force a form submit. But you're simply saying, okay, step, just simply send the JavaScript to the page to execute, and this will trigger the form submit and allow you to move your flow to another step. Obviously, this is the other verb, and as what you see here, it uses the old rendering technique to update itself. Okay, is there anything else I want to mention? Wow, no, I think not. No. So let's leave it at this. Yes, there's one other thing I need to mention. That's something that I forgot in the previous session, in the third session, we look at the JavaScript helpers. We should probably put this on the website. We'll do that soon. So you have the list, even though it's a very simple list. So we have the basic helpers, some class manipulation, form manipulation, ways to initialize the page, and this was the most important bit. How can you communicate? So here's the stepping function that does the synchronous form submit. Here's the send function that allows you to send a verb to a particular part with additional values. And if you want to use additional values, you need to call register to name the different parent, to say, okay, the first argument is called index, the second argument is called whatever. But there's also another helper function that's called aPost, which means asynchronous post. Actually, the send function uses this aPost function, and the aPost function sends the actual asynchronous request, and it submits all the variables that are part of this data table or data object. So you can use either send or aPost to call your part. But if you use aPost, you need to make sure that _part and _verb are fields that are part of this data object. But you can put in any additional fields that you like. You also don't need to use the register function to name them, because they already have names, and that's one of the reasons why it's very convenient. It's actually being used by many of the part-specific JavaScript handlers. Well, I somehow forgot to put it in the list, so there it is. Okay, I think this sort of concludes this quick flyby. Like I said, when we started out, I wanted to show you how you can build your own parts, and hopefully I've managed to convince you that it's worthwhile developing your own parts, because it allows you to extend our platform in so many ways and do things the way you want them to do. And there are so many things we did not implement in the base parts, which I think is okay, because you can write your own parts, and there are so many things that you can come up with. We've really designed our Flow platform to be fairly neutral to anything else. So there are no dependencies or on other JavaScript libraries for the all main functionality. So obviously we do have something like a date picker that uses a date picker library, but that's sort of the exception to the rule. If you don't use the date picker, you don't need any other libraries. But the thing is, you can use other libraries if you want to use them, and you can develop parts that use these libraries to your advantage. And again, by developing your own parts, you can do things your way, and I think that the platform is really open. Open to these extensions. It doesn't limit you, because in the end, building web applications is a matter of generating browser pages, generating pages for browsers, and simply putting stuff in that do things, that show things, but also that act on things, on user input and whatnot. And so I think the possibilities are pretty much limitless. and we don't really enforce too many things. So in any case, give it a try. I hope we've provided you with all the information that you need. If there are still questions, or if there are things you'd like us to discuss, there's the mailing list. Post your questions there, post any requests there, and we can see how we can address those. So I hope this has been useful. I've sort of taken different approaches to the different sessions. So we've done the live coding, we've done a quick review of existing parts. And like I said earlier, it really helps to study existing parts and pick up tricks and little techniques to help you tackle any problems that you face. And obviously in the third session we did a really big rundown of all the aspects that are important. So I hope it's been helpful. Thank you for watching, and maybe till the next video. Bye bye.